2 of my kids have profound autism, nonverbal, can't read, can't write, really can't even function at a toddler level. They are now 26 and 19 years old. About 12, 13 years ago, I had the incredibly bizarre experience of discovering that when I was a fetus, I had been very, very heavily exposed to what are called synthetic steroid hormone drugs that were given to my mom with the intention that they would help prevent miscarriage. After millions of fetuses were exposed to Makena. Makena is basically 17-OHPC, hydroxyprogesterone caproate. Anybody can look it up. One of the greatest drug scandals of our time. This drug that we're giving to induce a transgender is the same drug that we've been giving to pregnant women for years and years. Completely under research. Millions of fetuses exposed to this drug heavily during a period of very rapid brain development, which is basically the second half of pregnancy. And there's been, I found all the studies, that have been done, but they're very, very few compared to, the gargantuan extent of exposure. So it seems to affect personality development. It probably affects kind of gender role.
I'm thrilled to meet you, Jill Escher.
It's nice to meet you. Let me pull up the right window. Oh, there I am. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. I suppose usually myself and Mia discuss, gender dysphoria and the huge rise of gender dysphoria and the bad diagnosis and how it's been kind of, a lot of the information has been, almost, what's the word? There's been a conspiracy of silence around it. And today we're moving into something completely different, which is your territory, which is something else has happened.
It's different.
It's very different. It's a similar thing. What are you thinking, Mia? You're jumping in. Yeah.
That's the thing. It's a different thing, but I just find the parallels are so unbelievably striking between what you write about and the influence of autism activism and the science, or the appalling science, the effect of politics. It's what we do, but just in a parallel world.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of parallels. Definitely. The neurodiversity movement, I think, is very similar to the, there are 5 million gender movements. It's like, every form of mental functioning is just diversity rather than, having a discussion about impairment and pathology, which is the case in autism, less the case in gender differences. But there are a lot of similarities, but I think I pointed you guys to some pieces that I wrote about the effect of exposures. So my world, although I do a ton of autism activism, obviously I do a ton, but I'm very much grounded in the world of how synthetic steroid exposures and how other exposures influence our gender development, our sexual development, and have generational effects. So that's a very, very, very complicated topic, but a very important one that I think doesn't get really enough airtime in the debates. Everybody seems to think, well, it's all cultural. And I come in, I'm like, no, we really have to think about our biological context here. And it's really new territory, I think, for most people who don't, have any background in toxicology or don't know the history of some of these, drugs and exposures. So it's like it's a tangent, but not really a tangent. So I think it's really relevant. So I'm happy to talk about autism. I'm happy to talk about exposures and gender development and all that.
To begin, could you possibly tell our audience who you are, where you come from, and the kind of basic information they need to know so that they can kind of fall in with this conversation because I know we're going to get technical quite quickly.
Oh my God. My story is really complex and very long. I'll try to do a nutshell of it. But the story starts with me being a fairly typical mom with no history of autism in her family, and my husband, no history of autism in his family. And, we are reasonably functional people. And I had no risk factors in either of my in my pregnancies, but two of my kids have profound autism, nonverbal, can't read, can't write, really can't even function at a toddler level. They are now 26 and 19 years old, a boy and a girl. I have two. Yeah. So Johnny is 26 and Sophie is 19, both nonverbal autistic.
And you have an older child as well, is that
I have
correct?
an older child as well. He's not diagnosed with autism, and he has his own life. He lives different state, doing his own thing. But my other children are very severely disabled. So, there's been a very dramatic increase in autism, and we still don't really understand what is causing these increases. And to cut a very, 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 very long story short, because believe me, it's a very complex story. About 12, 13 years ago, I had the incredibly bizarre experience of completely out of the blue, discovering that when I was a fetus, I had been very, very heavily exposed to what are called synthetic steroid hormone drugs that were given to my mom with the intention that they would help prevent miscarriage. She had had two prior miscarriages, and the thinking at the time, and I'm quite old, so this was 1965. The thinking at the time in some of these very elite fertility clinics, they were kind of pioneering fertility clinics, was that if you just gave this mother a whole bunch of different synthetic hormones, really powerful synthetic hormones, it would help create a more quiescent, there they use that word, quiescent, abode for the fetus, and it might lead it to being a full-term fetus. Anyway, I was born, I guess, almost full term. And then it was forgotten, right? My mother got injections every single week of powerful synthetic drugs. She was given corticosteroids, synthetic progesterones, two different kinds, and two different kinds of synthetic estrogens to a lesser degree than the progesterones. The progesterones were given in huge quantities. But then it was forgotten, right? My mom never told me about it. It wasn't in my medical records. And then I grew and I developed, and I was kind of normal. I'm a very fairly successful person. And then I had two kids with idiopathic autism, which was completely unexplained and remains completely unexplained today. So it got me very interested when I made this really weird discovery, which would take a long time to explain how I even made this discovery, that I had been exposed to these drugs. And I got detailed records of my mother's exposures, which is incredibly rare. I came up with this hypothesis that something happened to my eggs, right? I was exposed to all these laboratory-made, very powerful chemicals whose job it is to change gene expression, mind you. It's their job.
Yeah.
Right? That's what hormones do. Steroid hormones attached to receptors go to the DNA and they change gene expression, right? So I had this idea that something had happened to my eggs, essentially, and that somehow raised the risk for autism in my offspring. This hypothesis started there, but it has since sort of spun in different directions and continues to spin, and we continue to look for other things that might be exerting heritable effects. And it's early days. It's still very early days for this hypothesis.
Can I jump in? So I have written about when they gave mothers DES, which I can't pronounce, but you were not given DES?
Diethylstilbestrol.
Okay, thank you. I read your piece, which was brilliant. You are a brilliant writer. Every piece of yours I've ever read is amazing. But this one was really interesting to me because I've written about DES before, and the daughters of the women given DES suffered a very rare and aggressive vaginal cancer that was never seen in children. It was the children were suffering from vaginal cancer. So, and there's concern that even the granddaughters of these women will as well. So you're onto something, because there's definitely an effect in the child, not the mother, right?
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, it had an effect in the mother. It increased the mother's risk for
Oh,
developing cancer.
breast
So
cancer. Yeah, yeah.
you find that a lot of these women who took DES died at very early ages because of cancer. I mean, it was the biggest medical catastrophe,
Yeah.
right? And people don't even know about it. People think, oh, the worst medical catastrophe was thalidomide. Thalidomide was a horrible catastrophe. That was around 1960. That resulted in children being born without limbs, basically, on other
Yeah.
things. DES affected far more people,
They gave it
especially
to
in America.
millions and millions of women over decades.
So it
Yeah.
affected the moms, it affected the fetuses, which are both male and female, exposed to huge doses of synthetic estrogens. And now we're also finding that it's affecting the third generation in sometimes different ways.
Could I ask, because you two know a little bit more, and I'm more like the listener and the viewer who's trying to catch
Sorry.
up.
Yeah.
And so on their behalf, as well as my own, you know, am I right in thinking this was between the 1940s and the 70s?
Yes.
Did it stop? How can somebody, any mother who's listening, having a heart attack listening to you, thinking, could I be a DEF baby? How would they know if they were? What
Such a
information?
question.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, as I said, this was an amazing miracle that I was able to obtain these detailed records of
Were they,
hormone
sorry, just one more question. Were they given to stop miscarriages or something
It
like
was
that?
to stop
Yes.
miscarriage, and it didn't even work.
And it
It
didn't even
actually
work.
increased miscarriage. It
Yeah.
didn't even work. What they did to these women for nothing.
Oh, it's horrific. It's beyond a scandal. I mean, the makers of this drug really got off easy. They've caused countless billions of dollars of damages.
Sorry,
I
I can't. I've got so much to say,
Yeah.
because they knew, the man who invented it warned, because he
Odds.
realized the people handling it. Yeah, the people handling it were, the men were developing breasts and the rats were developing cancer, and he warned right away. He
Mhm.
made it, and he warned right away, this is dangerous stuff. And then they go ahead and give it to millions and millions of pregnant women for
in
no reason.
insanely high doses. Yeah. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's, as I said, it's a scandal beyond scandal. So, yeah, so I would never ever have known if it wasn't for the fact that, number one, my mother's obstetrician kept some, not all, some records on microfiche, even from
Wow.
1965. That almost never happens. Secondly, and most importantly, I was a subject of a study done on young children who had been prenatally exposed to synthetic steroid hormones. And I happened to discover that by just doing a Google Scholar search online. And I'm
Wow.
like, I read about this study. I'm like, wait a minute. I think I was one of those kids. And I remembered the people coming to my house. This woman coming to my house when I was 8 years old in Los Angeles and asking me all these questions like, do you play with dolls? Let's
But
play with some dolls. They wanted to figure out how my gender was developing.
If you're a mother, and you're having a heart attack, you're listening to Jill Escher right now, is there any way they can trace back? Do they ask their own mother some?
They can ask their own mother, but their mother probably won't remember, and their mother probably won't be able to get any records. I mean, I was really a 1 in a million story. They can try. The moms often weren't even told that they were being given these synthetic hormones. They were sometimes told, this is a vitamin. This is a vitamin. They weren't even told. My mother, if I asked my mom, what did you take when you were pregnant with me? She said, oh, a lot of stuff.
Oh,
She didn't know.
yeah.
She's still alive today. If I were to talk to her right now, she would be like, oh, that's nice. I didn't know what those were. She wouldn't know.
And it did an impact. Maybe I would do, yes.
Yeah, I mean, you don't know.
But Jill, you're not a DES baby, though.
No.
You were never. Your mother was never given DES. You had a whole
Other
other
drugs.
combination. Yeah, that's what's
Exactly.
fascinating.
Yeah, and I've become close with the DES community because I
Okay.
feel like we have a common bond, even though our chemicals were different.
Yeah.
If I had been a DES daughter, chances are I would have developed, some form of cancer by this time. I mean, believe me, I know people who have perished, from having aggressive cancers as a consequence of being one of my best friend, her older sister, the only one of all these kids who was a DES daughter. And she developed an aggressive breast cancer and died around early 50s. So this is pretty common.
The impact of gender roles with the DES babies.
Yeah, that's a really good question. It actually has been studied both here and in France. They've found, interestingly, that the early studies found that when the female fetuses were exposed, that they were sometimes slightly masculinized by the exposure. And that probably has to do with these really weird crosstalks that happen between exposures and the functioning of the HPA, axis. They're probably too complex to get into now. Not that I understand all of them. In the males, and this is why I wrote that piece about Rachel Levine, in the males, they often had the effect of feminizing their brains. And I think this is really important. People say, well, sex develops as a consequence of chromosomes. And, that's mostly true. That's obviously mostly true. You have a Y chromosome with an SRY gene on it. That SRY gene, in combination with other factors, will lead to the development of gonads. The development of gonads will lead to the development of testosterone, which will masculinize the fetus, right? Okay, that's kind of textbook. However, if you are that male fetus and you don't have any exposures in early development, you will develop male testes and you will develop male external genitalia. That happens, in the first weeks, really, of the pregnancy. But the brain is continuing to be very susceptible to these hormonal influences. And DES did, at least in some cases, seem to feminize the brain. So what I've found in my DES community, and I've spoken to quite a number of these gentlemen, are males whose brains were feminized because of DES in utero. And they are sometimes, not always, trans. And sometimes they'll become trans. Like I talked to a guy who was becoming trans like in his 60s, who'd been fighting this his whole life. And now as a 60-year-old male is like dressing as a female and taking estrogen. I mean, so it's really complicated. People cannot underestimate the absolute power of hormones to shape our development when we are, it obviously shapes them even when we're older, right? And that's how people do gender affirming care. But, especially when we're an embryo and fetus.
I think, I read that piece. I think we disagree on
the Rachel Levine piece.
Yeah, the guy in his 60s who is saying, he was a DS baby or whatever. Autogynephilic men, typically, they come out in middle age, they're heterosexual, and they don't want to have autogynephilia. That's paraphilia, in which they're aroused at the fantasy of becoming women. It's the most common reason why a man in middle age will come out as a woman. And they will look for any other explanation. And so I remember when reading your piece, I thought, that's an autogynephilic man, I'm sure of it. But obviously I don't know. That's my instinct. That's what I jump into.
I can't know for sure. I've spoken to enough of these gentlemen who struck me as extremely honest. They talked to me about their struggles that they felt even as children, as adolescents. Some were married, some were not. Some are now really, operate as females, some don't. They were kind of all over the board. I didn't really see one story. So obviously I'm not a diagnostician and I can't tell, but I find that pretty plausible, especially in light of the fact that there's quite a bit of research, especially from France, showing that DES exposure to the developing fetus can feminize the brain. And that wouldn't be shocking, right?
No.
We have all these estrogen receptors in our brains. the males aren't supposed to be hit with all this estrogen. And then they are, and then, the brain develops along a more feminine line. I find that very plausible. Might there be other cases? I mean, I don't know.
There's
Frank,
a problem
Mhm.
with the trans explosion. I'm just throwing this out there. I just be logical.
Yeah.
If the DES babies were, really a product of mothers from the 1940s to the 70s, well, then the explosion would be, if you follow me, it would start really with, I suppose, from the 70s onwards.
That's very good, Stella. It's happened far too late. I didn't even pick
Right,
up on that.
right. No. I
Mm.
think you are right. I mean, the trans phenomenon, especially in youth,
It's a
seems to have
social
really picked
contagion.
up in the past, I don't know, 10, 15 years or so. That's
Yeah.
kind of what
We
it's.
don't know. We don't know third generation impact here.
Yeah,
Cool.
no, we don't. But DES is one exposure, and it affected, maybe 3, 4, or 5% of pregnancies, at that time, which was a lot of pregnancies. But we shouldn't be only worried about DES. I mean, there are a lot of exposures that can impact fetal brain development, especially psychosocial, psychosexual development. And that would include probably, and based on the animal studies, even something like SSRIs,
Yeah.
And I would say even things like, sedatives, anesthetics, these can have profound effects on the function of the steroid hormone system. And there are others as well.
What
And just
about? Oh, sorry. So much
have
to
to.
ask.
There's so much to say. This is going to be fast. And there was an explosion of tomboys in the 70s, which Lisa Selin Davis kind of tracks.
Oh, interesting.
Yes.
Okay.
Now I've always thought that was societal, but you've just thrown something into my mind. There's so much to study about all this. Anyway, go Mia. Sorry.
No, mine was just a tiny thing because I remember when I was pregnant with my first child, and you know what you're like when you're pregnant with your first, I was certainly paranoid about everything. Like every single thing I put in my mouth, I was so afraid that it was going to somehow poison my baby. And at the time, just as I was pregnant, there was the big scandal about some kind of chemical in plastic water bottles, BPA. I don't know what it is.
BPA, yeah.
Do you think that's one of them? Because I was freaking out because I had my water bottle and it had BPA and I'd been drinking from it and I was pregnant and I overreacted probably.
I think some people would argue, yes, BPA is an estrogenic chemical, a pervasive. Here's some BPA for you. Pervasive, in our environment. Might it have some subtle effect? I mean, remember these doses of BPA are going to be really, really, really low
from my
compared to something like a medication that you're given, like DES or like SSRIs or other things. But psychiatric drugs have these effects as well. But anyway, I think these are good questions that are really under-researched compared to the fact that we see, this growth in non-standard sexual identity. Again, I think you guys are a little bit more on the culture side of things. I'm a little bit more on the biology side. There could be an interplay of the two. I don't know. I'm not a researcher, but I think these things are very, very under-researched relative to how pervasive these exposures are in pregnant women. And then, of course, the second generation effects, which I'm obviously very interested in as well. But I should say, because I think that you were asking about me being, if I was affected, if my gender development was affected by my exposures. And the answer is that I've always been super tomboy and I'm very heterosexual. I don't have any gender dysphoria at all. I'm definitely female, no problem there, but very, very not feminine female. I mentioned that I had been studied when I was 8 years old by this researcher. Her name was June Reinesh. She went on to become a very famous hormone researcher. And she was the head of the Kinsey Institute, which I'm sure you guys have heard of for a long time. Yeah. I think she wrote like the Kinsey report or something. Anyway, so Dr. June, she's actually still alive. After I discovered that she had studied me when I was 8, I contacted her. And I'm like, I think I was one of your study subjects. And she said, oh, yes, you were. And she went on to explain to me the findings that she made in her career about the effects of these exogenous hormones on fetal, you know, gender development and just basically, psychological development, personality. She was really interested in personality. And she found, she called it flavoring. That's what she said. She said these progestins, which are fake progesterones, which are some of the things that I was exposed to. She said, those had the effect often of flavoring the fetus. Like you wouldn't have outright teratogenesis. Teratogenesis means like a birth defect. Like I wasn't born with 6 fingers. I wasn't born with a giant head or anything. But she said, these flavored the personality, flavored their gender, kind of development as well. And there are a number of studies that look at both females and males who were exposed to these drugs. And I don't want to bore your listeners with all with all of these, but one thing before I go on with this, let it be said, yes, DES use stopped in the 70s. Progestin use, right, synthetic progesterone use in pregnancy continued until 2023 when the FDA finally withdrew approval for that drug.
What?
So people don't know this. People don't know the same exact drugs, or at least one of them, that I was exposed to. It was packaged as a drug called Makena. It was given by injection to pregnant women who had had prior miscarriage or prior preterm birth. I'm sorry. It was billed as an anti-preterm birth drug, no longer as an anti-miscarriage drug. It was completely ineffectual, which is why the FDA finally withdrew approval for it after millions of fetuses were exposed to Makena. Makena is basically 17-OHPC, hydroxyprogesterone caproate. Anybody can look it up. One of the greatest drug scandals of our time, completely under-researched, millions of fetuses exposed to this drug heavily during a period of very rapid brain development, which is basically the second half of pregnancy. And there's been, I found all the studies, that have been done, but they're very, very few compared to, the gargantuan extent of exposure. So it seems to affect personality development. It probably affects kind of gender role, but most of the studies were done on kids. You don't see follow up to adolescence and adulthood, which absolutely should be done.
Is your thesis that a lot of these children who have autism have had mothers who had been given drugs or hormones that they don't know about? Is that your main thesis?
No. No. So my main thesis that I work on as an autism philanthropist. So when I say philanthropist, I mean I fund pilot studies and I do a lot of advocacy, like a ton of advocacy. My concern isn't that these drugs are causing autism per se, although I do think with SSRIs, they are increasing, for example, anxiety. They may be reducing masculinization of male fetuses, etc. There's reasons to be concerned about a lot of these drugs that might not extend all the way to autism. The thing I work on is what I mentioned earlier, which is I have 2 kids, right, with idiopathic autism. Idiopathic means cause unknown autism. And I'm concerned about my eggs, right? What could have happened to my eggs? And that's where my philanthropy goes. It goes to the germ cells. What has been happening to human germ cells when they are bombarded with these foreign substances, especially something that is steroidogenic or have the ability to change how genes function? And it's not just steroids. Obviously, I'm very interested in other things. So my work focuses on germline level exposure, not exposure to the fetus. Although almost all of toxicology, like the entire world of toxicology, is about what is called somatic cells. So somatic cells are like everything in our bodies except for our germ cells. And there's very little toxicology done on our germ cells. And this has been, of course, a huge obstacle for me to push these ideas forward because we don't have a huge base to build on.
And you wrote a piece recently, maybe it's your most recent one. It was about the did the Department of Health and Human Services produce a report? That piece, it was so funny. I felt your exasperation in there. You were saying, I've said this 5 million times and nobody has listened to me. But you had this hallelujah moment when you found at the bottom that they were talking about precision toxicology. Is that
Yeah.
what you're talking about now? And
Kind of, yeah. So I'm really talking about exactly precision toxicology, which is the very last line of this MAHA report. It was called the MAHA report. It was like 72 pages long, literally like the bottom of page 72. It says, a direction for research should be precision toxicology, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, yes, that's kind of where we have to go with this. Because the stuff that I'm talking about doesn't show up in most epidemiological studies or even in most sort of mouse studies or there's a lot of toxicological assays that can look at effect of a chemical on, on genetics. It can basically look, is it a genetic toxicant? Is it a carcinogenic, the carcinogenic properties, et cetera. But no one really looks at my question, which is the poor, forgotten, egg and sperm and all their precursors. So, I've been doing this advocacy for more than a dozen years, and some people do listen to me. I mean, we have some really good animal studies that actually show that this happens, that this is how it happens. It just hasn't been followed up with the human studies. So now what happened last week was the NIH announced its $50 million autism research initiative. It was called ADSI, Autism Data Science Initiative. And it really said explicitly, we want to study understudied factors that may be increasing the prevalence of autism. And I thought, well, this is good, but it was really poorly written. It was really poorly written, and there were all kinds of problems with it. And I've written to my friends at the NIH saying, can we amend this, please, to get rid of some of these problems? I won't get into the details. So we'll see. But like right now, like the letters of intent are due the end of this week, like Friday, June 6th, which is like so fast. Like they just announced this thing and the letter of intent supposed to be out like June 6th. Like this is not how science works. Science takes time. You have to build the collaborations. You have to figure out all the details. So it's on this hyperdrive, which makes no sense. But I'm hoping, so I'm like cautiously optimistic, right? I'm hoping that this is an opportunity to kind of think outside the box a little bit and think of these novel ideas, including this germline idea, which would explain why is autism so heritable? Why does autism start in the early transcription, the early development of the brain? Why is it our rates different around the world? There's so many things that could be partially at least explained by these new ideas. So I just keep pushing. I mean, I'm like a professional nudge. That's what I do. I'm like, did you think about that? Can you add this or how, and
is there any impact of the sperm? You've said, how your eggs might have been impacted.
Right.
What about how your husband's sperm might have been impacted if he had had a mother, if you follow me?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And people don't understand spermatogenesis, right? And so they're like, well, it couldn't have affected the men because the sperm are produced, in the 90 days. Spermatogenesis is just in the 90 days before conception. Well, it's like, no, that's really not how it works, because what happens in the testes is you have these things called spermatogonial stem cells. Those are produced in the early embryo, those stem cells. And from those spermatogonial stem cells develop, the spermatids, the spermatozoa, boom, whatever, throughout gametogenesis. So what might happen to a male, I mean, my husband, to my knowledge, didn't have any, unusual exposures. I talked to his mom about it while she was alive, and, there was nothing. She didn't even smoke. She didn't drink, nothing, and wasn't on any medications that we know of. But similar to, so, like girls, we're born with all our eggs. And that's kind of true. I mean, there are still things that happen in development prior to conception. Meiosis is not complete. at not remotely complete, at by the time we're born. But the content of our eggs are already there. They're kind of sitting there. And in fact, a lot of them, they die off and we're left with like 40,000, I think, eggs by the end of the whole process. But anyway, to males, they're born with all their spermatogonial stem cells. They're not born with all their sperm, but they're born with their spermatogonial stem cells. And so what happens in utero can really affect the content of those cells. And when I say the content, I'm generally talking about an effect that's called epigenetic. And I don't know if your readers or listeners, I'm sorry, have come across the term epigenetics before. What do you think? Probably not.
Oh, I need it explaining. So,
Okay. So everybody knows genetics. Everybody knows genes, right? So each one of our little cells, right, has the full complement of our 23 pairs of chromosomes and all of the genes on those chromosomes. And those genes are expressed in different ways to create proteins that create us, right? So like these cells, my skin cells are busy creating proteins that create skin, but my heart cells are busy creating proteins that create heart. The DNA is the same throughout the body, but the DNA is expressed differently depending on the tissue. Now, how these genes are expressed is incredibly complicated. I mean, the genes, people think, oh, everything's genetic. Genes don't do anything. People have to understand, genes just sit there. They're like this silent template just waiting to be read. They're like a library. That's what genes are. They are a library just sitting there passively in our nucleus. It's all these other things happening in the cell that control how the genes are expressed. And there's various terminology for how this all works. I mean, I try to simplify it a little bit, and I refer to most of it as epigenetic, even though technically that might not be correct. But basically, there's these places on the DNA. You need to like bind to this place on the DNA, and then the gene will be read. And sometimes the DNA will be closed and you can't even access that gene, but sometimes the DNA will be opened by different factors. And once it's open, it can be read and then transcribed into a protein. There are certain things that tell the DNA to stop. Methyl groups don't transcribe, do not pass go, do not collect $200. That gene is turned off. There's all these different things that are happening in the genome that allow for transcription and sometimes a certain volume of transcription. And I'm just calling that epigenetics just for simplicity. So what can happen in the early germ cells is not just a mutation, right? We can always get a mutation, right? There can be random or maybe, caused by, let's say, chemotherapy. Chemotherapy, we know, for example, causes mutations in germ cells. So there can be a mutation, which would be like, a deletion of a letter or a wrong letter or, break in the DNA and something else happens. But with epigenetics, the DNA can remain completely intact, but how that DNA is read will be changed because these molecular factors in and around DNA will be providing the wrong instructions. The instruction book has just been rewritten and is not rewritten in the right way. So that's one way to understand epigenetics. And so my hypothesis, well, it encompasses genetics. I'm not denying it. Is primarily one around the idea that the epigenome in our germ cells can be rewritten and result in developmental defects in the offspring. It's really complicated. I mean, people don't learn this stuff in high school biology. And they're like, what are you even talking about? Like, it's really complicated and I have a hard time. People are like, give me the elevator pitch. I'm like, are you kidding me?
Can we actually go to basics? Because I must confess, I've learned a lot from you even before this conversation in reading your work, but I must confess that I was one of those. Autism rates are not actually rising. It's all just the expansion of the diagnosis. We broadened it to a spectrum and more people are being caught in the net. And reading your work, you totally convinced me that I was wrong about that. Can you break it down for any viewers that might still hold the view I had?
I love your question, Mia. And can I add, and can you maybe preface it with give us some numbers to show people that blow that point out of the water. Because I remember reading them when I was writing my book, Cottonwall Kids, in 2015. I was like, it doesn't stack up. These numbers are phenomenal, I think.
The numbers are absolutely phenomenal. The numbers are huge and they're very real. And you're right. I mean, listen, most people, the media is constantly like, there was an AP story today. It said the same thing, Robert F. Kennedy is saying that autism rates are increasing when in reality, it's only because of better, diagnosis. And it's like, can you give me a cite for that? Because there's actually no citation for that. There is not one citation for that, but they keep parroting this over and over again. It's just this echo chamber of journalists. But yeah, I mean, it's really obvious to everybody who looks at the data or the people who are in the developmental services system, this dramatic increase in children with very serious neurodevelopmental disorders, including autism. I'd say ADHD is another one as well. But if you want some data, for example, one that I like, 'cause I'm here in California, and I follow the California data very, very closely. And California has the best data of any state in the U.S. because we've had a very robust developmental services system for a long time. I mean, for at least 50 years, we've had a very robust developmental services system, very much unlike the system in other states. And part of the part of the legislative mandate was the collection of data. So we've been doing data forever. And what we saw, this is just like an example, the autism caseload in the state of California in the 1980s was about 3,000. By 1989, it was about 3,800. Then what happened in the 90s? So it was pretty flat. Like it just, you maybe saw a tiny, tiny, tiny increase in the caseload towards the end of the 80s, but no one really thought anything of it. Autism was considered very rare in the developmental services system. There were almost no adults with autism in any of the adult autism programs. There are very few of them in the institutions. Then what happened in the 90s, the number of people with autism doubled, and then it doubled again. And when it reached 16,000 autism cases, basically the legislature and the developmental services freaked out. And they're like, whoa, what is happening? Why do we have 16,000 cases of autism? We used to only have like 3,000 cases across the entire state. So they started commissioning studies and reports at that time. And again, this is in the 90s. And those reports found that this increase in the developmental system could not be explained by diagnosis, by changing of one category to another, like, for example, taking people out of intellectual disability and putting them into autism. It wasn't a diagnostic shift. It couldn't have been explained by immigration. So those studies looked at that stuff. They couldn't find this. This is unexplained. We don't understand it. So we were freaking out at 16,000 cases of autism in the 90s. Fast forward to 2025 today, we now have 202,000 cases of autism in our developmental services system. All right. So we've gone from 3,000-ish to 202,000-ish. And I think there's also about 5,000 cases that are pending. So it's not really encompassing all those cases. Okay. People say, oh, but Jill, that's just because, you're expanding it. No, the developmental services system is taking on all these mild cases that were missed before. No, that is not happening here. This is not the autism cases in our developmental services system, which is basically a fancy way of saying our Medicaid funded, system, is only open to those with substantial developmental disabilities who lack what are called they're incapable of performing three essential, basic life functions, right? Like communication or like, understanding, having certain cognitive ability. You have to be substantially disabled to get into the system. People with high functioning autism are laughed at and shown the door. Okay, so we're looking at extreme numbers, and that's just California. You might say, well, that's just California. But when you look at the California curve, it almost exactly tracks the CDC, which is a nationwide estimate, a nationwide epidemiological study. it almost completely tracks that curve, but the CDC's rate is higher because they're also including high functioning autism. So you see the same exact thing happening. Other states where we do have data, same phenomenon, same pattern. And we see it elsewhere too. UK. Oh my gosh, the UK there was just a report published last week. 3.3% of school children in the UK now have autism, which is very similar to the 3.22% that we see in the latest CDC numbers of US 8-year-olds.
And there are startling numbers in Ireland, are there not, Stella?
Oh my gosh, it was like 5 something percent. I have to look it up.
Figure out that because I've been thinking a lot about geographical regions, and I'm sure you're going to tell us, the info on geographical regions, and it's Northern Ireland that has
Northern
that
Ireland, yeah.
And Northern Ireland, particularly small, rural, by the way, lovely community that's highly traumatized from 40 years of the Troubles, bombing, and it's hard to explain the trauma that the north of Ireland has gone through. It's very hard to explain it, but it's significantly troubled. Of course, I'm a psychologist. I tend to go towards the psychology that it felt like, wow, that's very interesting to me. But the geographical regions, I know you can't probably talk about Northern Ireland. It's a weird area. There is something unusual about the north, but you do have points out that like this, there are centers, aren't there? Like it's much higher in New York compared to Tennessee, etc.
Yeah, well, the CDC has tracked, I think, a total of 16 different regions. They take little areas, sometimes not so little areas, and they don't do like a nationwide study where every single kid in the US is studied. They basically take sites and then they focus their, a research team on each site. And yeah, so for example, I think it was like Laredo, Texas. It was far lower. Like that was like the lowest, like 1% of the kids had autism. But then you went to San Diego, northern San Diego County, and those numbers surpassed 5, I think. Oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the exact number.
What's the most plausible explanation in your mind for that then?
Well, everybody seems to attribute it to case finding, right? That in northern San Diego County, they have a lot of screening. The pediatricians have been trained on these different screening methodologies, and they have these instruments that they use, and that's capturing more cases. Whereas someplace like Laredo, Texas, maybe it's a more immigrant community. I don't really know. And maybe more rural, and they don't have, this.
And you're arguing against yourself, Jill.
Yeah, no, I'm saying like this is the argument that they make.
Oh, that's what they say. Okay.
Yeah, and I'm not going to deny that might play a role. Like it might play a role, sure. This is a complex issue, but there probably are also regional effects. So the primary exposure that I work on is not steroid hormones, although that was, my exposure. The exposure that interests me most right now, and this is based very much on animal studies which show these effects, is the parent's history of surgery under general anesthesia. You might say, well, that's weird. What would that have to do with anything? And believe me, this is not something that I had considered before. So this is really in recent years. I think I first wrote about it in 2018. So I guess I'm on year 7 of this hypothesis. But it turns out that general anesthesia can be rather toxic to germ cells, which is, our gametes and the precursor cells. And we've seen in animal study after animal study that these exposures can exert an effect on the germ cells and therefore on the offspring's neurodevelopment. So the offsprings might have abnormal behaviors, might have abnormal learning behaviors, abnormal socialization, due to the fact that they derived from, a germ cell that was exposed to general anesthesia. So this is a really complicated hypothesis. It would take me hours to really explain the details. But nevertheless, let's say I'm right, and this hypothesis is correct. And we don't know if I'm right yet or not, right? We haven't conducted studies in humans. But let's say I'm right. Well, that would explain why you have higher rates of autism in more industrialized countries, in areas where maybe there's a lot more surgery, maybe there's a lot more plastic surgery Ahem. I won't point to New Jersey, but I'll point to New Jersey. Or Los Angeles, where I'm from.
Fact autism. Am I?
I know can I just say,
Mhm.
is it the mother, you're saying the mother had surgery in the period before she got pregnant and that
Yeah.
affect, like,
So
are
like
we
if the
looking
mom,
at what time frame are we
any
looking
time
at?
frame. This is the weird thing about this exposure. It's any time frame. So it could
Wow.
be when, like, it could be the mother when she was a fetus. It could be the mother when she was a neonate. It could be the mother when she was a child. It could be a mother when she was an adolescent. It could be a mother when it was preconceptional adult. So that's based on animal studies, right? This is not human studies. People don't yell at me saying,
Okay.
Jill, you know what you're talking about. There's no human studies. I know there's no human studies. I'm aware of that. But animal studies, mammals, this is rats and mice. This is what it does show this effect. So it kind
And
of, yeah.
this industrialized countries, because I suppose we're interested in this. Like, am I right? I think it's Singapore is very high, Tokyo is very high, Japan, as well as, let's say,
Japan's 3%, I think.
am
Yeah.
I right in thinking they're the higher rates, and New York
Yeah.
and California is that
Japan's
correct?
the data I've seen from Japan is pretty close to the US.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the industrialized countries are much
Higher
higher.
rates, yeah, than we see in, non-industrialized countries. So far, the epidemiology shows that. But then, people, they tend to attribute that again to, awareness and diagnosis and not to actual biological, nuance. And, as I said, I'm not here to say I'm right. I'm here to say that there are very major questions that have yet to be answered about autism etiology, about autism's heritability, about sex differences. Why are more males affected, than females by autism? It's about a 3 or 4 to 1 ratio. And these are things that we see in animal models that suggest we should be studying them in humans. So I really come as I said, as an autism research advocate. I'm also an advocate for research in how in synthetic sex steroids. Obviously, I think we need a lot more than we're doing.
Can I take it now into the area of autism activism then? The neurodiversity movement?
Yes.
And is that because to me it's so like trans activism in many ways, in that they reframed a disorder as an identity and therefore made it that like for trans you're not allowed to research the cause because it's perfectly natural and healthy. You're
Right.
not allowed to help the person try and overcome it because that's conversion therapy. But I see parallels to what you're talking about, the autism activism. It's not a disorder and it's ableist, is it not, to try and figure out what the cause is and to find a cure? Is there something like that going on that prevents this
Exactly.
research?
Yeah. Exactly parallel. Yeah, like it's all natural, like autism, like, Jill, you're 2 kids who are nonverbal and can't read and can't write and can't put on their shoes. Like that's perfectly natural, right? Like it's all natural. We shouldn't be researching causes. It's all genetic. I'm arguing that it's not actually genetic, it's genetic like. We shouldn't be why we shouldn't be, putting research into therapies because, these people are just expressing their true selves. While my son is like literally peeling off his skin. That's not a true self that I'm
Oh my
really willing to tolerate. So, I see a lot of parallels, and I, for one, I'm probably, I'm one of the few people I think who's written about this. I do think we should be researching causes of the increasing rates of trans identification and non-heterosexual identity. Now, obviously, a lot of it is natural. These people have been around, forever to one degree or another, whether they're gay or whether they're trans or bisexual or whatever. I mean, that's been around forever. So I'm not going to deny that there's some baseline there. But the problem is we're so far above this baseline that we should be concerned about things that might be contributing to gender non-conforming, brain development. And as I said, are there cultural components too? I don't know. It's not what I look at. It's not what I advocate for. It's fine. But honestly, the fact that, something like Makena, this drug that I told you about, the synthetic progestin that given to millions of pregnant women, and we're not even looking at the effects on the fetus. Oh, by the way, I didn't even mention this. This drug, Makena, 17-OHPC, it's a drug that has been given to male transgender M to F, right? To feminize the males. So it was part of a hormonal therapy, this particular drug. This drug that we're giving to induce a transgender is the same drug that we've been giving to pregnant women for years and years without, considering the effects on fetal brain development. I think it's insanely scandalous. But that's not the only drug. As I said, it's not the only drug that concerns me, but that's definitely one. So yeah, I definitely oppose those who say like, oh, autism, it's perfectly natural. It's always been here. Well, then why have we had a 70-fold increase, in autism in our, and how come we still don't know what's causing autism despite pouring all this money into genetics? It's insane. And we're shooting ourselves in the foot. These are legitimate scientific questions. They're uncomfortable for people. And I get it. Like, I have a lot of very high functioning autistic friends who really see autism as an important part of their identity. Fine. I get that's fine. I mean, whatever makes you happy. It's if this is how you build your sense of self, this is how you build your community, by all means, go for it. I don't want to interfere with anybody's, kind of person or set their personality building or whatever, however you want to phrase that. But you go a step too far if you say, oh, it hurts my feelings if you are studying causes. I was like, no, your feelings don't matter here. Your feelings matter as to you. But as to all these other people who could be harmed by these exposures, they deserve answers. And I really don't care if it hurts you that we're researching X, Y, and Z. So I think, it's the same thing with gender dysphoria. I mean, I think it's urgent, even though it's politically incorrect, to be doing this research. But, I've talked to researchers about, oh my God, I've talked to many researchers who are in the steroid hormone space, who are in the toxicology space, and also what they call DOHAD, developmental origins of health and disease space. So these are people who study especially, embryonic and fetal exposures. And they tell me I can't get a grant for that. Like they say, Jill, that's really interesting. I would never get a grant to study that because it contravenes, this dogma that, is so powerful. So you end up not getting research on these very legitimate scientific questions.
It does feel like academia is really in trouble. And I know it's irritating to even bring it up, but I know people will bring it up. So we probably have to. I don't know if I'm talking about the same thing as you, but the whole Andrew Wakefield, and he brought up that research all those years ago. And in a way, it was used as a weapon to silence anybody who had a question ever again about the
know. I agree. You're right.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that? Because honestly, I've definitely been very misinformed about autism in the past, but I have in my mind that Andrew Wakefield has maybe been misrepresented in the same way that Lisa Littman, who is the woman who published a paper just hypothesizing that rapid onset gender dysphoria there was a peer contagion, and she was so viciously attacked and vilified by trans activists that there's always been a little, I don't know enough about Wakefield and what he said, but I just always have this, did they do the same thing to him? Is he the villain that people make him out to be, or did they just treat him like Littman and unfairly persecute?
So for people who don't know, Andrew Wakefield wrote a paper in The Lancet that, from what I recall, and believe me, it's been a long time, from what I recall, it suggested that the MMR vaccine could be related to gastrointestinal issues, which could conceivably be related to development of autism.
Was it
I
just
don't
a
think
hypothesis then?
it
It
was
was
a
just a
yeah, I don't think he said like the MMR shot causes autism.
right.
I remember reading it so long ago and I didn't get the impression that's exactly what it said, but it raised all these questions about vaccines. And frankly, since then, he's gone on to become an anti-vax activist,
Oh,
even though
okay.
his paper,
Okay.
well, I think it was a questionable paper.
But Lisa Lippman has gone on to be what they would say a villain, and she's not.
But from what I know, I'd say there's a difference because, as far as I know, he did release it in 1998, and he doubled down. I felt on the vaccine. While I just
It
thought it was
did.
very important, it was raising questions, and
Yeah, I think that he really he was weird. I don't know what to say. I mean, I've never been an adherent of the vaccine hypothesis. I didn't live in that world. I didn't read all of their, materials. So I'm a little bit an outsider to the whole anti-vax movement. But my sense of him is that he just dug himself deep into a hole
Okay.
on it and just then couldn't get out. I think he's still in that hole from what I can tell.
Littman, she has expanded. She's worked in with detransitions. She's building a really strong, heavy canon of literature
To
and evidence.
support her original hypothesis. I mean, they still vilify
Yeah.
her, but it's completely unfair. She's an
Yeah.
excellent
I don't know much
researcher.
about her. I can't really
Okay.
speak to her, but with Wakefield, I feel that he just never, backed down. And as I said, he became more of an activist. He became like a film producer and he made this film like Maxed or something.
I do have a lot of sympathy. People become radicalized when they've been treated very badly, and I think he very badly, and he became
Part of it, I don't know. As I said, I'm not really close to that world. So I don't know. But we have to realize that public health institutions became very concerned about decreasing rates of vaccine uptake, about vaccine hesitancy in families, especially among mothers. And so they wanted to dispel this idea that vaccines cause autism. So, yeah, they were going to publicly, flay the enemy. But the problem is, really that I see it, that one of the tools that they decided to adopt was denying any increase in autism. Right. So they went one step too far. Yes, I think we can reasonably say like, okay, the research is really clear that vaccines aren't causing autism. Fine. But then they went further to say, well, there's no increase in autism. There's nothing to see here, nothing to worry about. When in fact, the data did not support that at all. Yeah, I think that the media and the public health, leaders kind of were in lockstep to basically keep people trusting vaccines, which frankly they should. I mean, in my opinion, they should trust vaccines. They didn't have to concoct this, confabulation about there being no increase in autism to achieve that. But, frankly, a lot of my friends, I have friends who still think, that vaccines cause their kids autism. And, honestly, until they have an answer, I'm not going to sit there in a lot of judgment of them. I really am not, because we have failed to provide answers for like 90% of autism families. And so they're going to think things. They're going to, this is human nature. I'm not going to get too upset about it. I just would like to see better research done so we can give them answers.
Okay.
I have a question about the activists and autism and
oh, they love me. Not.
I've often there's such a difference between Elon Musk autism and your children's autism.
Yeah, they're not the same thing. Yeah.
No, and it's not superpower. For I think it's 25% of people with autism. It's quite severe, and I'm just thinking about the phrase of autism, and I often wonder when I look at autism activism and everything. I often wonder about why wouldn't people with children that have your type of autism, if you follow me, which is very severe. They're not verbal. There's an awful lot of difficulties. Why not call that something like Kanner autism, like after Leo Kanner? If you follow me,
well, you're touching on a really topical issue and a very hot button issue right now, which is how do you subtype autisms, right? Because it's absurd to think like Elon Musk and my kids have the same thing. They obviously don't. Anybody like, with half a brain cell, right, could see that very, very clearly. So it's gone to this point of absurdity where people are like, well, Einstein had autism. Like, like I have kids who wouldn't even understand like what the word like science means. They wouldn't even understand like what a professor is or what German is or what Jewish is. If I were to talk about Einstein, like they would have no idea, right? So it's insane.
That I've often thought about, when you see a child with Down syndrome, you can see in their eyes the vacancy. And when you look at a kid with autism, you very often see something going on. I don't know,
but I wouldn't use the word vacancy. I'm going to be a little neurodiversity here because I'm friends with a lot of people with Down syndrome. They definitely have intellectual disability, although I've met some who are kind of really quite capable, which is really interesting as well. They're all very different. I wouldn't say vacancy, but they do have intellectual disability. They do very clearly respond to the world differently, right, than we do. But with autism, their eyes, like science actually is very clear on this. There's a lot of eye tracking studies. Their eyes work differently than the typically developing child. And you can see it very clearly in my kids. My kids are not going to sit there and look at you and respond to you with their gaze and da-da-da. Not at all. Like, my daughter will be like twitchy, 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 and my son won't look at you at all. So, I mean, I just want to say, like, this is actually a thing. But I want to get back to subtyping because I just attended the big annual autism research conference. It's called the International Society for Autism Research. It was just held up in Seattle in May. And a very big theme in many of the presentations and many of the panels at the conference was this need to really drill down and subcategorize, autism by, you name it, level of functioning. It could be by, certain biomarkers, which could be something like eye tracking or MRI studies, or even I won't get into the transcriptional studies. It gets complex, but there are. But I think that what the researchers were insisting was, we're getting to the point where we really can drill down and we can find more internally relevant and cohesive groups. So you talked about that 25%. So about 26.7% of all children, according to a CDC study, have what's called profound autism. So my kids both have profound autism. That's actually a term that is now kind of fairly generally accepted. And it refers to those with IQs under 50 who have minimal or no language, who need 24/7 supervision. Perfectly describes my kids. But 40% of people with autism, of children with autism, have autism with intellectual disability, to give you a sense. More than 60% have autism with IQs under 85. Right. So high functioning autism is actually not the majority of autism. High functioning autism, which I consider to be roughly parallel to, above IQ 85, that occupies 30 something percent of the autism space. And so we're really talking about really considerable impairments for most people with autism. Even those with high functioning autism are often very, very impaired. I mean, I know a lot who are still living at home with their parents.
Mm.
Yeah, in their 20s and 30s. So it's not a cakewalk.
So in DSM-4, Alan Francis introduced Asperger's, and then we went to autism spectrum.
In DSM-5.
In DSM-5.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not really much of a distinction. Asperger's would be high functioning, I assume, and then autism was profound autism. And
profound autism is a newer coinage, right? So profound autism wasn't around for either the DSM-4 or 5.
But just roughly, that's what it would have been. And do you think there should be more subcategories now?
Well, DSM-4, just go back to that. There was autistic disorder.
Yeah.
there was, which both my kids were diagnosed with, by the way.
Okay.
And that autistic disorder really referred to a very, pervasive impairment, right? Asperger's, those were kids with autism, but they didn't have unusual or delayed language development.
Mm-hmm.
Or it may have been unusual, but it wasn't delayed. It wasn't, they didn't have the same language impairments than, like, for example, the autistic disorder kids did. And then there was this other category called pervasive developmental disorder, another not otherwise specified, PDD, NOS, which is sort of like the garbage dump. You're like, I think it's autism. I think it's autistic disorder, but maybe it's not. So I'll dump you over there. But people who I know who were diagnosed with PDD, NOS kids, those tended to be pretty severe, really substantially disabled as well. So you had a little bit of categorization in DSM-4, not much. And then in DSM-5, what they did was they created autism spectrum disorder. They got rid of autistic disorder. They got rid of Asperger's. They got rid of PDD, NOS. And there was also another kind of, what was it called? Childhood disintegrative disorder in DSM, whatever. That's beside the point. But what they did in DSM-5 is they created functional levels, level 1, 2, and 3. Right. So level 1 is, you needed minimal support, but you still needed some support, and you were still, awkward, and you still had impairments in your social communication and in your repetitive behaviors. Level 2 would be like, okay, you have language, but you're not really able to communicate at age level about, in an appropriate manner. So, for example, I am sort of a pseudo mom to a 33-year-old young man with level 2 autism, and he's verbal, and he can put on his own clothes, and he can take his own shower, and he can talk to you about, like, what he did that weekend and where he wants to go for dinner, but he can't have, like, an adult conversation about, like, news. I think I mentioned it. We were together yesterday, and I think I mentioned to him something about, the Israel-Palestine conflict. And he's like, what? Like, but he can tell you every word of, like, every Disney film ever made. Okay. So that's like a level 2 autism. And then my kids, who can't really talk at all, level 3, and who need help really with every single aspect of their lives. So that's the current DSM-5 scheme. And frankly, it's not horrible. At least they do have those levels. I don't think the levels are perfectly conceived, but we don't see that really used very much. Like, we don't see level 1, level 2, level 3 used even clinically. So I do think we need to, and as I said, this was a big topic of discussion among the researchers this year. We will see probably more movement to create these internally coherent categories,
because they're working on DSM-6. But my other question is, does autism belong in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders? Is autism a mental disorder? Does it belong there?
It's is ADHD in the DSM? Is intellectual disability in the DSM? Those things are in the DSM. So then autism should be as well. These things have roots, right, in abnormalities of early brain development. All of these things,
Okay.
ADHD,
Yeah.
autism, intellectual disability, probably even things like, severe anxiety, some other, disorders as well, probably have roots in how the brain doesn't wire up properly. So, since we don't have, like, this diagnostic and statistical manual of how the brain doesn't wire up properly, we only have, like, mental disorders. It might as well just live there, for lack of a better place for it.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, these are clear. I mean, there are people who say, oh, autism's just a difference, and it's something to be celebrated, and it's just a condition that's benign or whatever. I'm like, you have to be kidding me. This is one of the most devastating impairments, and one of the most devastating disorders in the history of man. So, like, I'm not going to be gaslighted by all those people who are like, oh, we should just see it as a natural difference. It's like, no, these are people who unimaginably impaired. And my good friend lives not far from me. She has a son, who's in a football helmet all the time because he's beating his head constantly. He has bruises all over, his face and his body from just constant self-injury. He he can't talk at all, obviously is very minimal comprehension, but he'll scream and yell like all day. You'll have to wear earplugs if you're in the same room with him. Like, how in the world can anybody trivialize something like that? How is that remotely moral? Again, I don't sit in any judgment of my friend's son. I don't. It's not his fault. I sit in no judgment, but I do want to figure out how we can prevent that and how we can treat it, which seems to me to be a rational, approach, I think.
I know we're going to have to let you go soon, but I do want to ask you, it kind of ties in with that I think it was probably in your Free Press article that I read it. I'm not sure. You talked about a strange experience you had where you had posted a photograph of what your son did to the inside of your car.
Yeah.
Can you tell that story?
Well, this is how times have changed. So that was probably 2017 or so. So my son, he's now on some medications that actually help him with his property destruction and his self-injury. Thank God. He's on an antipsychotic, low dose. But the way he experienced life was to destroy things, right? He didn't really have capacity. He can't understand a story. He can't read a book. He can't play a game. He doesn't, he can't even use a computer. He can't really do very much. But one thing he is capable of doing and that gives him some satisfaction is destroying the hell out of things.
Okay.
I mean, because for him, again, no judgment of my son. It's the way he's wired. So, I would wake up in the morning and one of the area rugs would be shredded into bits, or the photo hanging on the wall would be off the wall and the glass is broken and the photo that was in there was shredded to bits or whatever. Well, he loved destroying the interior of cars. That was huge fun for him. And I posted a picture of my Prius, the backseat of my Prius, where basically it was just some foam and springs. It was all that was left. Everything else was gone because he had ripped it all up. This was very normal in our lives. So I posted it. I'm like, this is my son. This Johnny did this to my car. And then the neurodiversity people. This was especially that we're talking high watermark of cancel culture. And they would just pounce on me how could you violate your son's privacy? How could you be so disparaging of autism? And I'm like, I'm just telling the truth about one person's experience of having severe autism, right? I'm not saying anything about everybody else. I'm talking about my son, and I'm very much entitled to tell his story because Lord knows he can't tell it by himself. I could make decisions for him. And so they just went on this anti-Jill rampage, and people would make up crazy things about me and post complete lies online because they were so mad about me posting this stupid photo. Anyway, what happened as a consequence of that, because I was, I'm friends with obviously a lot of like-minded moms, is we're F that. We're not that's ridiculous. And so we became more and more and more vocal about our children and their realities. And it's at the point now where they don't even touch me. I can write whatever I want. They don't complain. It's over. That cancel culture period is over. Well, thank God. But I had years of these ridiculous social media pile-ons and people calling me every kind of name on the planet. It's ugh, it was gross.
But the beauty of it is you doubled down and you showed no fear and you didn't give
No
in,
fear.
and now they leave you alone.
No giving alone. No, exactly. So what I learned is that you don't give them an inch.
Yes.
Don't give them an inch, because once you do, then, they just come after you. They sense weakness and they come after you. And I'm like, no, you have the wrong mom. Not backing down on this. No. I mean, I love my son so much. I'm out with my son every day. In fact, right after this, I'm going to take him out. I love him, but I feel part of my love for him is telling his truth, telling his story. It's not me being antagonistic to Johnny and making fun, in light of his situation, making fun of him. Like, I'm not like, I would never do that. But if we want to advance their cause, we have to tell their stories. There's no way around it.
Yeah.
I have a couple of just kind of quick fire questions. I'm so conscious of our time, but there's a few questions I'm dying to ask you. So even if you give a short answer, because we have taken enough of your time. There's 3 in my mind. I don't know if you've got another last
Oh
question,
no,
Mia.
I'm done. You take it.
Well, one would be just a straight question. Do you think level 1 autism is overdiagnosed?
That's such a good question. That's a really, really important question. I talk to clinicians about this very, very question. And this is what they tell me. They say, Jill, we have, children or sometimes adults, they come into the clinic. Some is very good clinics, high quality, diagnoses. And they'll be subclinical. And so we won't give them an autism diagnosis, but they still have stuff. Like, they still have things going on. They still have measurable impairment that might not rise to the level of the diagnostic threshold of autism. They might have clear, social impairment. They might have slight, chewing their fingernails all the time or doing kinds of, other repetitive behaviors that are very mild, at least compared to the ones that, like, my kids have. So I think, they say there's stuff going on that doesn't quite reach the threshold, but that is nevertheless should be taken seriously. I think in some other clinics, those people who are sub-threshold, for example, at Stanford, do get a diagnosis, like from a community practitioner, a level 1. Now, what do I think? I feel like everybody who needs help and who has a mental impairment should get some sort of diagnosis. I don't want to say to somebody who really feels like they are isolated, that they lack the capacity to, engage socially, or like that they're, that their executive functioning, that's a really big thing. Executive functioning is very, very big. That their executive functioning is so poor that, they can't hold down a job, even as an educated adult. This is something we see all the time. These things are important. I don't want to trivialize them at all. I never want to trivialize level 1 autism or subthreshold. But it's a question of labels. It's like, could we, in fact, what they tried to do, I don't know if Alan Francis talked about this in DSM-5, they tried to create this new category called social communication disorder to kind of address that high functioning group that didn't quite fit autism. Nobody uses it. So the people behind the DSM wanted to make a bifurcation. It didn't happen. And so what clinicians are doing is they're throwing them into level 1 autism.
Okay.
Do I think it needs to be remedied? It does.
Okay. I better ask you the other 2.
Okay.
This might seem a bit random. I'm thinking of anime and gender dysphoria and the extraordinary connection with the 2. And the extraordinary connection that I've noticed with Disney and autism.
For sure.
What is that?
For sure. God, that's another good question. I can't really speak to anime and gender dysphoria, right? Because it's not really my world. But I see a lot of people with autism having a real obsession with Disney. I think it's just something that they can comprehend. It's not too complex. They love characters. They love the characters. The characters are almost like their friends. Like, I talked about my friend who I'm sort of a pseudo mom to, 33-year-old young man. These characters, I would go and I would say, I think it's time to throw out some of your stuffed animals. And he'd be like, no, they're my friends. These are people, they're really close to the characters. They're really close to the stories. They're very alive for them. It's something that they can grasp, something that is within their capacity, whereas something like the Israel-Palestine conflict, like that's way too abstract. That's too difficult. That's not something that would take a lot of reading or something to figure out. Disney, you can figure out without having to read or do too much. Or anime, yeah, I don't know, but it's juvenile, right? It's juvenile, and it relates to some level of cognitive, impairment.
And for people who can't read subtle emotions, arguably, they're told happy, sad. And the same with animals. It's like, here is the emotion. This is it. This is clear. And maybe that they like the simplicity of that.
Yeah, I don't know. It's, as I said, it's not my world, but definitely in autism, I think that's true.
My last question is about ABA, and also where do people find your Escher if they need it? But ABA, I think, has become, what is it? Applied behavioral
Analysis.
for autism. I know some years ago, because I remember my colleague and friend, Sasha Ayad, used to work with autism, and she used to work with ABA, and they used to teach children gender norms as part of the ABA program. So they would teach young children how to, behave like a boy or behave like a girl, and also cue and take their turn and, do various things in autistic behavior. And what is your thoughts? ABA became kind of controversial as far as I can get there.
Yeah, it's still controversial. So ABA is kind of a form of kind of intensive teaching that historically has relied on behaviorism, which is basically you're rewarding, a desired behavior and trying to limit undesired behaviors through various means. And it became popular in the 90s because there were some anecdotal evidence and there was some published evidence of questionable quality that showed that a program of intensive ABA, like with a child who was maybe 2 or 3 or 4 years old, maybe 40 hours a week, could alter the trajectory of their autism and in some cases result in a child who didn't have an autism diagnosis. So way back when my son was diagnosed in 2001 and I was desperate to do anything to try to help him, I fell for that. And I'm like, okay, let's get an ABA program going for as many hours as we can to see if he can't, because remember, he had no language at all. He had no play skills at all, to see if we can get him to build those skills. And I just, I didn't know what I was doing. I was just a dumb mom. And of course, it completely failed. It was a total waste of time and money. It probably traumatized him. And a lot of this evidence for ABA having these positive effects was really bad science. Nevertheless, ABA is helpful for some kids with autism. There is some research showing that it can improve, for example, social skills. It can improve some communication skills. It can reduce undesired behaviors in some children at some ages in some programs. So I definitely don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. I think there are positive elements to ABA that have to be retained. However, I believe that its promise was dramatically oversold and it was used inappropriately. I think a lot of these businesses now, they're private equity businesses that like own these ABA companies. Remember, there's no accountability for results. There's zero accountability. You can keep throwing hours at a kid, and if the kid doesn't get better, there's no accountability for that. But there's a lot of Medicaid money, a lot of school district money spent on these programs, and so I'm not against ABA. I want to say that, but I am in favor of spending our money more wisely, and I am in favor of interventions that actually help the child. What would have actually helped my son, actually, when he was younger, was probably medication and not a behavioral program. But I didn't know that. Hindsight's 2020.
Thank you. It's amazing. We could talk to you for hours.
Really?
So there's autism is such a big field. I mean, and then you bring in all this, gender stuff.
How do people find you? Because I think we'll meet again.
Yeah. Okay. So I have a website where I compile some of my writings at just my name, Jill Escher, one word, ESCHER.com. And then there's a link to my, I think my Gmail address, jill.escher@gmail.com. You're welcome to email me if you have any questions or comments.
Phenomenal.
Thank you. Really. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks so much. I appreciate the invite.
Thank you.